You may be seated. Happy Feast of St. Philip Day. This is my first time being able to preach on these propers of the Feast of St. Philip, because it is a feast day that not all churches recognize or celebrate. And so as I was doing some research about St. Philip's Day, I went to the very reliable and scholarly site of Wikipedia. And while there, I found that the last entry mentioned that the Catholic and the Episcopal churches recognize Philip as a saint, but that the Anglican Church does not. And that the Episcopal Church only added Philip to the list of saints because he is the patron saint of the Cathedral of St. Philip in the Diocese of Atlanta. Now, I couldn't find any sources to corroborate this information. However, to any Episcopal churches out in the world celebrating St. Philip's Day today, I'd like to say, you're welcome. And so then I wondered, because of course our dean is a renowned and enthusiastic liturgist, if perhaps he had composed today's collect. It turns out he did not compose it, although he did help write the first and best line, which says, "Holy God, no one is excluded from your love, and your truth transforms minds." No one is excluded from the love of God, and God's truth transforms minds. I almost wonder if perhaps our readings today could have been read in reverse, because our gospel reading from Matthew, these are the last words from Jesus to the disciples in the Gospel of Matthew. And he tells the disciples to go out and make disciples of all the nations, teaching them and baptizing them. And then he says that I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And then our reading from Acts describes the early church in its first days and weeks and years and what that looked like. One of my best friends likes to call it the acts and the shenanigans of the apostles. And in this story, we have Philip, who was not an apostle, but was appointed by the apostles to be one of the first deacons of our church. And not only was Philip a deacon, but he was also an evangelist. He loved to tell the story of Jesus. And so I have had, as a former Baptist, I have had the hymn, "I love to tell the story," in my head all week. I know that we have some recovering Baptists in here, so maybe you remember this hymn too. "I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme and glory, to tell the old, old story of Jesus and his love." And indeed, that is what Philip does. He is walking along a wilderness road, having been called there by an angel of the Lord. And he comes across this chariot where an Ethiopian eunuch is traveling back to his home country from Jerusalem. This man had traveled to Jerusalem to worship. And in his chariot, he was reading from the prophet Isaiah. This was a man who was seeking God, seeking to be in a deeper relationship with God. And yet, because he was a eunuch, he would never be able to fully convert to the Jewish faith. And so here he is reading this prophet of Isaiah, and Philip comes up beside him and asks, "Do you know what you're reading? Do you understand?" And he says, "How could I?" So Philip plops down beside the Ethiopian and starts telling the story of Jesus. He loved to tell the story to anyone and everyone in any place. Even before this, he had been in Samaria telling the story of Jesus to Samaritans and converting them to the Christian faith. No one is excluded from the love of God. And so Philip is telling the story of Jesus, and I like to imagine that, you know, when you have some really good news that you just can't hold in, and that the words just kind of fall out of your mouth before you even have time to think about what you're saying. I imagine that that's how Philip spoke about Jesus. That he was so excited about this story that the words just fell from his mouth. And the Ethiopian was so inspired by this story of Jesus that when they came across some water, he says, "What is to stop me from being baptized right now?" And so Philip stops and they baptize the Ethiopian. He was not excluded from the love of God. The truth transformed his mind. And in that moment of baptism, the Ethiopian found a deep sense of belonging. I am struck by two things about this story. One is that we all have a desire to belong to something. This idea of belonging is one that has long been of interest to me. When I was in college, I wrote a paper on developmental economics all about how these villages on the Amazon that I had visited, how the sense of belonging affected their economy. Belonging. And then when I was a youth minister, I wanted to write a dissertation about the theology of belonging at camp. You know how when you go to summer camp, there are these traditions, and on the first day it feels very exclusive because you don't know what's going on, but by the second day, because those traditions are so accessible, you feel like you belong to something bigger than yourself. And it's a good and a beautiful thing. In this moment of baptism, the Ethiopian was able to belong to something bigger than himself. And when we baptize these two children this morning, they too will be able to belong to something bigger than themselves. And as we renew our baptismal covenant with one another today, we will belong to something greater than ourselves. The love of God excludes no one. But I'm also struck that when we share Jesus, we find Jesus. I imagine that as Philip was talking to the Ethiopian about Jesus and telling this story that he loved to tell, that the Ethiopian was not the only one who discovered Jesus in that moment, but that Philip found Jesus in that moment too. It is in sharing Jesus that we find Jesus, and in sharing love that we find love. And when we do that, when we are evangelists, like our patron saint, when we share the story of Jesus, we find a deeper sense of belonging for us all. Because Jesus tells us to go and make disciples of all the nations, not just our like-minded friends. And Jesus reminds us that he will be with us always, even to the end of the age. So friends, my hope for us this week is that we will go out like Philip, and that we will tell the story of Jesus and his love, that we will love to tell the story, and that in doing so, that we will find Jesus as we share Jesus. And we will find that we all belong together. Amen.